I am the wife of a dead man, or at least that is what I thought I was for the past 4 years. The day I buried my husband in my mind was the day I promised myself to work hard and take care of the kids we had together. But one quiet afternoon, guess who showed up at my doorstep? Yes, you guessed right. My ex-husband. He came back with a cock and bull story, telling me about the story of he was being kidnapped and all that shenanigans. But one thing he didn't know was I already knew the real reason why he left I and our kids. You won't believe what that reason was.
Long before Adams became a wealthy and respected mechanic in Lagos, he was simply a young man with grease-stained hands and an ambitious dream. His small workshop sat on a dusty street tucked between a spare parts store and a roadside food vendor. It wasn't the kind of place that attracted rich customers or luxury cars. Most days, the vehicles that arrived were old taxis, worn delivery vans, and motorcycles that had seen far too many years on Lagos roads. The workshop itself was modest. The metal roof rattled loudly whenever the wind blew, and during the rainy season, water would sometimes drip from tiny holes above. Adams worked with a small set of tools that he guarded carefully, wiping them clean every evening before locking them away. Business was slow in those early years. Some days, Adams would sit on a wooden bench outside the garage waiting for customers who never came. Other mechanics nearby often laughed at him for spending so much time perfecting his craft when most people only cared about cheap repairs. But Adams was different. He believed that if he worked hard enough and learned everything there was to know about engines and machines, one day the world would notice. And someone else noticed his dedication long before the world ever did. Her name was Michelle. Michelle had met Adams when he was still struggling to build his workshop. At the time, many people in her life questioned why she would choose a man with so little money and such uncertain prospects. But Michelle saw something deeper than wealth or comfort. She saw determination. She saw a man who never gave up even when life was difficult. She saw someone who respected people and believed in building something meaningful. To Michelle, those qualities were worth far more than money. When Adams asked her to marry him, he didn't offer her a luxurious house or expensive jewelry. All he offered was honesty and a promise that he would work hard every single day to build a better life for them. Michelle accepted without hesitation. Their wedding was simple but joyful. Close friends and family gathered in a small hall to celebrate their union. Adams looked nervous but proud as he held Michelle's hand, knowing she had chosen to stand beside him during the most uncertain stage of his life. After the wedding, they moved into a small apartment in Lagos. The apartment had only 2 bedrooms and a living room that doubled as a dining space. The furniture was modest, and sometimes the electricity went out without warning. Yet Michelle never complained. Instead, she focused on turning the small apartment into a warm and loving home. She woke up early each morning to prepare breakfast before Adams left for the workshop. Sometimes she packed food for him to eat later in the day so he wouldn't have to spend money buying meals outside. But Michelle didn't only take care of Adams. She also embraced his parents as though they were her own. Mr. and Mrs. Akena were growing older and sometimes struggled with their health. Whenever they visited, Michelle welcomed them warmly, preparing their favorite meals and making sure they were comfortable. If Mr. Akena needed help walking up the stairs, Michelle was always there to support him. If Mrs. Akena felt tired, Michelle would gently encourage her to sit down while she finished cooking. Over time, Adams's parents began to see Michelle not just as a daughter-in-law, but as a true daughter. They often told friends how lucky their son was to have married such a kind and devoted woman. A few years into their marriage, Michelle gave birth to their first child. They named her Donna. Donna was a bright and curious little girl who filled the apartment with laughter. Adams adored his daughter and often carried her around proudly whenever he returned home from work. 3 years later, their son Andrew was born. With 2 children running around the house, life became busier but also more joyful. Though money was still limited, the small apartment was always filled with warmth, conversation, and laughter. Michelle devoted most of her time to raising the children and managing the home. However, she also started a small bakery business from their kitchen. She baked cakes, bread, and pastries which she sold to neighbors and nearby shops. It wasn't a large business, but it helped contribute to the family's income. Michelle placed every bit of profit she earned into the joint account she shared with Adams. She believed strongly that marriage meant partnership, and she wanted to support her husband in every way she could. Adams appreciated her efforts. At least he did in those early years. Meanwhile, his workshop slowly began attracting more attention. One afternoon, a wealthy customer brought a luxury car that several other mechanics had failed to repair. Adams spent hours studying the engine, carefully analyzing the problem. Finally, he found the solution. When the car started perfectly again, the customer was amazed. Word began spreading about the young mechanic who could repair even the most complicated vehicles. Soon, expensive cars began appearing at his workshop more frequently. Business improved, and Adams hired 2 assistants to help manage the increasing workload. For the first time since starting the garage, Adams began seeing real financial progress. He saved enough money to move his family out of the small apartment into a much larger home in Ikoyi. The new house had a spacious living room, a modern kitchen, and bedrooms large enough for the children to play comfortably. Michelle was grateful for the change, but she remained the same humble woman she had always been. Even after moving into the new house, she continued caring for Adam's parents with the same devotion as before. Every Sunday evening, Mr. and Mrs. Ikena came over for dinner. Michelle prepared meals carefully, making sure each dish matched their preferences. Donna and Andrew loved those evenings because their grandparents often told them stories about their father when he was younger. Those dinners became a cherished family tradition. Adams, meanwhile, continued expanding his business. His reputation as a skilled mechanic grew rapidly. Soon, car owners from wealthy neighborhoods across Lagos began bringing their vehicles to his workshop. Some of the cars he repaired were worth more money than he had ever imagined owning in his entire life. The garage became known as one of the best places in the city for repairing luxury vehicles and complex mechanical systems. Money began flowing steadily. Adams started wearing more expensive clothes and buying better tools for his workshop. He enjoyed the respect he received from customers who admired his skills. For years, he had worked tirelessly for this success. Now, it was finally arriving. Michelle watched her husband's progress with pride. She believed that his success was the reward for years of dedication and hard work. To her, nothing mattered more than seeing their family grow stronger and more secure. Yet, sometimes success does more than change a person's financial situation. Sometimes, it changes the person themselves. And as Adams's wealth continued growing, the man Michelle once knew so well would slowly begin to disappear. The humble mechanic she married was about to become someone entirely different. But Michelle had no idea that the life she had helped build was slowly moving toward a betrayal she could never have imagined. Success arrived in Adam's life slowly at first, like a quiet tide rising beneath his feet, but once it began, it did not stop. Within a few years, the small workshop that once struggled to attract customers had become one of the most respected auto repair garages in Lagos. Luxury cars lined up outside his shop almost every day. Wealthy businessmen trusted him with their expensive vehicles. Some even sent drivers from other parts of the city just to make sure Adams personally handled the repairs. His name started spreading across Lagos. People no longer called him that young mechanic on the dusty street. They called him Adams, the expert. With the success came money. A lot of money. Adams expanded the garage into a much larger facility. He hired more workers and purchased advanced diagnostic machines that other mechanics could only dream of owning. His once modest lifestyle began changing quickly. He bought expensive watches, designer clothes, and luxury shoes. Customers who once treated him like a simple mechanic now greeted him with respect. Some even invited him to exclusive gatherings and business meetings. For a while, Adams enjoyed every moment of it. But success has a strange way of revealing what truly lies inside a person's heart. And slowly, the humble man Michelle had married began to disappear. At first, the changes were small. Adams started coming home later than usual. Sometimes he would arrive after the children had already gone to bed. When Michelle asked how his day had been, he would answer briefly before disappearing into the bedroom or scrolling through his phone. Michelle told herself he was simply tired from work. After all, the garage was busier than ever. But the distance between them continued growing. Soon, Adams began making comments that Michelle had never heard from him before. One evening during dinner, he stared at her for a moment before shaking his head slightly. "You really should start taking better care of yourself," he said casually. Michelle looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, look at you," Adams replied. "You used to look more attractive. Now you just stay home all day baking cakes." The words hit Michelle harder than she expected. She forced a small smile and continued serving the children their food, pretending the comment had not bothered her. But it did. Another night, Adams walked into the living room while Michelle was helping Donna with her homework. He glanced around the room and sighed. "Sometimes I wonder what exactly you do all day," he said. Michelle looked up. "I take care of the children, run the house, and manage the bakery orders." Adams shrugged dismissively. "That's not really work, Michelle. I'm the one bringing real money into this house." Michelle stayed quiet. She had never cared about who earned more money. To her, marriage had always been about partnership. But Adams no longer seemed to see it that way. The criticism slowly became more frequent. He complained about the way she dressed. He mocked the bakery business she had started. He often compared her to other women he met through his business connections. "Those women actually have ambition," he said one night. Michelle felt the sting of the words, but chose not to respond. Instead, she focused on maintaining peace inside their home. Donna and Andrew were still young. She didn't want them growing up surrounded by conflict. Michelle poured her energy into raising the children and growing her small bakery. Her cakes and pastries had become popular in the neighborhood, and she often received large orders for birthdays and small events. Every time she made money, she quietly deposited it into the joint account she shared with Adams. She believed that even the smallest contributions mattered. But Adams barely noticed. To him, the bakery was nothing compared to the growing income from his garage. What Adams never realized was that Michelle's financial situation was far more stable than he imagined. Before her parents passed away, they had left her a significant inheritance. They had worked hard all their lives and saved money carefully, wanting to make sure their only child would never struggle. Michelle had placed that inheritance into a private account. She never told Adams about it, not because she didn't trust him, but because she wanted him to succeed without feeling like he depended on her family's wealth. She wanted his success to come from his own hard work. And for many years, it did. But now Adams had begun believing something very different. He believed that his success belonged entirely to him. The arrogance slowly crept into his personality, like a shadow growing longer with each passing day. He spent more time outside the house, attending business meetings, social events, and parties with wealthy clients. Michelle often stayed home with the children preparing dinner and waiting for him to return. Some nights he didn't come home until midnight. Other nights he claimed he had to travel for work. Michelle sensed something was wrong, but she refused to jump to conclusions. She still believed the man she married was somewhere inside the person Adams had become. Unfortunately, Adams had already started living a second life. Her name was Pearl. Adams met Pearl at one of the high-end lounges he had begun visiting with some of his wealthy clients. Pearl was younger than Michelle and possessed the kind of beauty that attracted attention instantly. She dressed elegantly, spoke confidently, and seemed impressed by Adams's success. Unlike Michelle, who had witnessed his struggles from the beginning, Pearl only knew a wealthy version of him. And Adams liked that very much. With Pearl, he could pretend he had always been successful. He could tell stories about his achievements without mentioning the years Michelle had supported him through poverty. Pearl listened with admiration whenever he spoke about his business. She laughed at his jokes and complimented his appearance. Adams found the attention intoxicating. Soon their meetings became more frequent. What began as casual conversations quickly turned into a secret relationship. While Michelle stayed home baking cakes and helping Donna with her schoolwork, Adams was often out with Pearl, enjoying expensive dinners and late-night conversations. He convinced himself that he deserved this new life. After all, he had worked hard to build his success. And in his mind, Michelle no longer fit into the future he imagined. The more time he spent with Pearl, the more resentment he began feeling toward his wife. He started viewing Michelle as a reminder of the past he wanted to leave behind. Instead of appreciating her loyalty, he began criticizing her more harshly. To Adams, Michelle had become an obstacle, a problem he needed to solve. And slowly, the idea of escaping his old life started forming inside his mind. Adams believed he had outgrown the woman who once stood beside him during his hardest years. What he did not understand was that the path he had chosen would eventually destroy everything he thought he had gained. And somewhere deep inside that dangerous path waited a decision that would change all their lives forever. Saturday mornings were usually Michelle's quietest moments of the week. The children were still asleep, the house was peaceful, and the early Lagos sunlight streamed softly through the curtains of the living room. It was one of the few times she allowed herself to sit down and breathe before the responsibilities of the day began. That morning, she sat on the sofa with a cup of tea resting on the small table beside her. Her phone was in her hand as she absent-mindedly scrolled through Instagram, moving from one post to another without much attention. Most of the posts were ordinary things: pictures of food, family photos, advertisements, and short videos people shared about their daily lives. Michelle wasn't really looking for anything in particular. She was simply passing time before she needed to wake the children and begin the usual routine of breakfast, laundry, and preparing for the bakery orders she had promised to deliver later that afternoon. As she continued scrolling, one particular post caught her attention. It was shared from a relationship discussion page called Commitment. Michelle had seen posts from the group before, but she rarely stopped to read them. The page was known for allowing anonymous people to share personal problems about relationships and marriages, while strangers offered advice in the comment section. Normally, Michelle found the posts dramatic and sometimes even ridiculous. But for some reason, this one made her pause. The title of the post read, "I want to leave my wife without her ever finding me." Michelle frowned slightly and tapped on the post. The anonymous writer began by explaining that he had been married for several years, but no longer loved his wife. According to him, she had become unattractive, boring, and no longer exciting. Michelle felt uncomfortable reading the words. The man continued explaining that he had recently started dating a younger and more beautiful woman who made him feel alive again. He said he wanted to start a new life with this woman somewhere far away, possibly in another continent where no one from his old life could find him. But there was a problem. He didn't know how to leave his wife and children without causing trouble. So he asked the people in the group for advice. Michelle kept reading, feeling a mixture of disbelief and anger. The anonymous man wrote that he had considered pretending to travel for work and then simply disappearing. He even suggested faking his death so that his family would stop looking for him. When Michelle reached that part of the post, she felt a deep sense of disgust. She couldn't imagine someone doing something so cruel. She scrolled down to the comment section, expecting people to criticize the man for such a terrible idea. Instead, she saw something far worse. Many of the comments were actually encouraging him. Some people suggested that he should travel overseas for a job and slowly reduce communication with his family until they believed something had happened to him. Others recommended paying someone to publish a fake death notice in a newspaper so that his wife would accept that he was gone. One comment even explained how he could return years later with a story about being kidnapped or trapped somewhere without access to communication. Michelle stared at the phone screen in shock. She could not believe that so many strangers were helping someone plan such a betrayal. To abandon a wife and children like that felt heartless. She shook her head slowly and whispered to herself, "People can really be wicked." For a moment, she thought about replying to the post. She wanted to tell the anonymous man that what he was planning was evil. But then she remembered that arguments on the internet rarely changed anyone's mind. So instead, she simply closed the comment section and placed her phone on the table beside her. There were more important things to do. Michelle stood up and walked toward the kitchen to begin preparing breakfast for the children. Soon, Donna and Andrew would wake up, and the peaceful morning would turn into the usual busy routine of family life. Within minutes, the strange post had already started fading from her mind. Meanwhile, several kilometers away across the city, Adams was sitting inside his workshop. The garage was unusually quiet that morning. Most of his workers had not yet arrived, and the few vehicles parked outside would not be worked on until later in the day. Adams leaned back in his office chair with his phone in his hand. On the screen was the same page Michelle had been reading only minutes earlier, the commitment relationship group. But Adams wasn't reading the post. He was the one who had written it. The anonymous message about a man who hated his wife and wanted to disappear had come directly from him. He had spent almost an hour carefully writing the post, making sure to hide any details that might reveal his identity. To Adams, it was simply a practical question. He wanted advice from people who had no connection to his life. He scrolled slowly through the comments, reading each suggestion carefully. Some of the ideas made him laugh. Others made him think more seriously. The idea of pretending to travel for work seemed realistic. After all, his business often required him to deal with suppliers and machines in other locations. No one would question it if he said he needed to travel. And the idea of slowly disappearing after that seemed even easier. Adams leaned back in his chair and smiled to himself. Everything could work perfectly. He would tell Michelle he had received a major repair contract overseas. He would promise to send money for the family and keep in touch regularly. Then, after some time, he would slowly stop responding. Eventually, someone could send a message claiming there had been an accident. His family would believe he had died. And he would finally be free to start a new life. A new life with Pearl. The thought made him feel excited. Pearl had been encouraging him to leave his old life behind for months now. She believed Adams deserved more than the quiet domestic routine he had with Michelle. Pearl often told him that a successful man like him should live freely and enjoy life without restrictions. Adams had started believing her. To him, Michelle represented the past, the struggling mechanic, the small apartment, the years of hardship. Pearl represented the future, a life filled with excitement, luxury, and admiration. As Adams continued reading the comments on his post, he felt increasingly confident about his plan. The strangers in the group had given him exactly what he needed: encouragement, validation, permission. He locked his phone and placed it on the desk. The decision was already made in his mind. Very soon, he would begin putting the plan into action. He had no idea that at the same moment he was finalizing his betrayal, Michelle had already read his words. And even though she did not yet realize the man behind the anonymous post was her own husband, the truth was already quietly moving closer. Because sometimes the plans people make in secret have a way of returning to them in the most unexpected ways. And Adam's carefully designed escape was about to set in motion a chain of events he would one day regret for the rest of his life. Later that same evening, Adams returned home earlier than usual. Michelle noticed immediately. For months he had been coming home late, often after the children had gone to bed. But that evening, he walked through the front door just as she was finishing dinner in the kitchen. Donna and Andrew were sitting at the dining table arguing playfully over whose turn it was to choose the cartoon they would watch later. Michelle looked up from the stove when she heard the door open. "You're back early," she said gently. Adams forced a smile as he loosened his tie and walked into the living room. He looked around the house briefly as if studying something, though Michelle could not tell exactly what. "Yes," he replied casually. "I needed to talk to you." Michelle wiped her hands with a towel and walked into the dining room. The children were still laughing, unaware that something important was about to happen. "What is it?" she asked. Adams cleared his throat. "I got a call today from a company overseas," he began. "A very big company." Michelle listened quietly. "They repair heavy machinery used offshore," Adams continued. "Some of the machines are similar to the engines I've worked on before. They want me to travel there and fix several systems that their technicians cannot handle." Michelle nodded slowly. "That sounds like a big opportunity," she said calmly. "It is," Adams replied quickly. "They're paying very well." He sat down at the dining table and leaned forward slightly. "But the job might take a while, maybe several months, possibly longer." Michelle kept her face neutral. Inside her mind, however, something stirred. The anonymous post she had read that morning suddenly resurfaced in her memory. A man planning to leave his wife. A man pretending to travel for work. A man who wanted to disappear. For a moment, Michelle felt a strange chill run through her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "How long exactly?" she asked. I'm not sure yet, Adams replied, avoiding her eyes. It depends on how complicated the repairs are. Michelle nodded again. And you'll be able to communicate while you're there? Of course, Adams said quickly. I'll call, send messages, everything. He gestured toward the children. I'm not abandoning my family. The words hung strangely in the air. Michelle studied his face carefully. For years, she had learned to read Adam's expressions, the small movements of his eyes, the tone of his voice when he spoke. Something about him felt different, but she didn't confront him. Instead, she simply said, if that's what you believe is best for your work, then you should go. Adams looked slightly surprised by her calm reaction. You're not upset? He asked. Michelle shook her head gently. No, she replied. This is part of your career. We'll manage here. Adams seemed relieved. Good, he said quickly. I'll still send money every month for the house and the kids' school fees. You won't have to worry about anything. Michelle gave a small smile. Thank you. The conversation ended there. Neither of them spoke about the topic again that night. Later, after the children were asleep, Michelle stood quietly by the bedroom window looking out into the darkness. Her mind replayed the anonymous post she had read earlier. The words echoed clearly in her memory. A man who hated his wife. A man planning to disappear. Michelle sighed softly. She still wasn't certain. But something deep inside her heart told her the two situations might not be unrelated. Still, she decided not to accuse Adams of anything. Not yet. Instead, she simply waited. The following morning, Adams packed his luggage. Michelle helped him fold some clothes, while Donna and Andrew watched curiously from the doorway. Daddy is going on a trip for work, Adams told them cheerfully. Donna hugged him tightly. Bring me something nice when you come back, she said. Andrew clung to his leg without fully understanding what was happening. Adams kissed both children on the head. Then he picked up his suitcase and walked toward the door. Michelle followed him outside. For a moment, they stood quietly in the driveway. Take care of yourself, Adams said. Michelle nodded. You too. He got into the car and drove away. Michelle watched the vehicle disappear down the street. Then she turned and walked back into the house. Life continued normally for the next few weeks. At first, Adams kept his promise. He called occasionally. He sent a few messages asking about the children. He even transferred some money into their joint account. But the calls gradually became less frequent. The messages became shorter. Eventually, days passed without any communication at all. Michelle tried calling him several times, but the phone either rang endlessly or went straight to voicemail. Donna sometimes asked when her father would return. Michelle always gave the same answer. Soon. Inside her heart, however, she had already begun preparing herself for the possibility that he might never return. About a month later, a letter arrived at the house. The envelope had an unfamiliar company logo printed in the corner. Michelle opened it slowly. Inside was a formal letter explaining that an accident had occurred during offshore mechanical operations. Several workers had been injured. One technician named Adams had reportedly died during the incident. Michelle read the letter twice. Her face remained calm. She folded the paper carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Anyone watching her might have expected tears or shock. But Michelle did not cry. Instead, she simply sat quietly on the sofa. For a long moment, the anonymous post from the commitment group returned to her mind once again. The man who wanted to fake his death. The advice strangers had given him. The plan to disappear. Now everything made sense. Michelle closed her eyes briefly. So this was your plan, she whispered softly. She was not angry. Not even surprised. Perhaps somewhere deep inside her heart she had already known. But Adams had made one critical mistake. He believed Michelle was helpless without him. He believed she depended entirely on his money and protection. He believed she would collapse the moment he disappeared. What Adams did not know was that Michelle had already begun thinking about the future long before the letter arrived. And now that the truth had revealed itself, she was ready to take control of her life in a way Adams could never have imagined. The disappearance he had planned so carefully had finally happened. But the story was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. 3 months had passed since the letter arrived announcing Adam's supposed death. Life inside the large Ikoyi house had slowly settled into a quiet routine. Michelle focused on caring for Donna and Andrew while continuing to run her bakery business from home. She also made sure Adams's parents visited often, just as they had done when Adams was still around. Mr. and Mrs. Ikenna had been deeply saddened by the news of their son's death. Losing a child, even an adult one, was something no parent could easily accept. Yet Michelle remained strong for them. Whenever they visited, she prepared their favorite meals, spoke to them gently, and tried her best to comfort them. To the outside world, she appeared like a widow who had accepted her fate with quiet dignity. But Michelle carried a secret knowledge that only she possessed. She knew Adams was not dead. She knew exactly what he had done. Still, she chose not to reveal the truth immediately. Not yet. She understood that the news would destroy his parents, and she wanted to wait until the right moment. That moment arrived unexpectedly one hot afternoon. Michelle had just finished baking several cakes for an order when her phone rang urgently. It was Mrs. Ikenna. Her voice sounded panicked. "Michelle, please come quickly," she said breathlessly. "Your father-in-law collapsed." Michelle's heart skipped. "Where are you?" she asked. "We are at the hospital," Mrs. Ikenna replied, struggling to hold back tears. "The doctor said it was a heart attack." Michelle did not waste a second. She quickly asked a neighbor to watch the children and rushed to the hospital. When she arrived, the hospital corridor was filled with the sharp smell of antiseptic and quiet tension. Mrs. Ikenna sat outside the emergency room, her hands shaking as she wiped tears from her face. The moment she saw Michelle, she stood up and hugged her tightly. "They said his heart is weak," she whispered. "They are trying to stabilize him." Michelle held the older woman gently. "It will be all right," she said softly. A doctor soon came out of the emergency room holding a clipboard. "Are you family?" he asked. Michelle nodded. "Yes." The doctor explained that Mr. Ikenna had suffered a severe heart attack and required immediate treatment and monitoring. Several medical procedures would be necessary to ensure his recovery. Then he mentioned the cost. The total estimate was over 6 million naira. Mrs. Ikenna gasped softly. "That much?" she whispered. The doctor nodded. "It's urgent," he said. "If we delay treatment, his condition could worsen." Michelle looked at the worried expression on Mrs. Ikenna's face. The elderly woman looked completely overwhelmed. "Where is your son?" the doctor asked. "We tried calling the number listed in the medical records." Mrs. Ikenna hesitated. "We have been trying to reach him too," she said slowly. "But his phone has not been connecting." The doctor looked concerned. "We will need someone to approve payment immediately so we can proceed." Michelle took a deep breath. "I will handle it," she said calmly. Mrs. Ikenna turned toward her in shock. "No, my dear," she said quickly. "This is too much money. You cannot carry such a burden alone." Michelle gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "He is my father too," she said quietly. The doctor nodded and asked Michelle to follow him to the billing office. As they walked down the corridor, Michelle knew the moment she had been avoiding had finally arrived. Back in the waiting area, Mrs. Ikenna sat silently, trying to process everything happening around her. When Michelle returned after speaking with the hospital staff, the older woman looked at her with worried eyes. "My dear," she said softly, "where exactly is Adams?" The question hung in the air. For months, Michelle had avoided answering it directly. But now she realized she could not continue hiding the truth. Michelle sat down beside her. "There is something I need to tell you," she said gently. Mrs. Ikenna looked confused. "What is it?" Michelle took a slow breath and explained everything. She told them about the anonymous post she had discovered in the commitment group. She explained how a man had described his plan to abandon his wife by pretending to travel overseas and later faking his death. She described how Adams had come home that same evening with the exact story. She told them about the sudden trip, the gradual silence, and the suspicious letter announcing his death. Mr. Ikenna had been moved to a recovery room by then, and when he regained consciousness, Michelle repeated the story to him as well. The room fell into heavy silence. Neither of the elderly parents spoke for several minutes. Finally, Mr. Ikenna shook his head slowly. "Our son," he whispered. Mrs. Ikenna covered her face with her hands. "I cannot believe this," she cried softly. Michelle remained calm. "I did not want to tell you earlier," she said gently. "I did not want to break your hearts." Mr. Ikenna looked at her with tired eyes. "And yet you are still here," he said quietly, "taking care of us." Michelle nodded. "You are family," she replied. Just then, the hospital administrator entered the room with the payment forms. Michelle stood up and handed over the necessary documents. "I will settle the bill," she said. Mr. and Mrs. Ikenna stared at her in disbelief. "You cannot do that," Mrs. Ikenna said quickly. "This is too much money." Michelle smiled softly. "I have some jewelry Adams gave me," she explained. "I can sell them." And that was exactly what she did. Within hours, Michelle arranged the payment and ensured the hospital continued the necessary treatment for Mr. Ikenna. Watching her sacrifice something so valuable without hesitation changed something deep inside Adams's parents. They looked at Michelle not as a daughter-in-law anymore. They saw something far greater. Mr. Ikenna held her hand gently later that evening. "My child," he said quietly, "what kind of heart do you have?" Michelle looked confused. "You knew our son abandoned you," he continued, "yet you still sold your jewelry to save my life." Tears filled Mrs. Ikenna's eyes. "Our own son left us," she said softly. "But you stayed." In that moment, both parents realized something painful and beautiful at the same time. The woman their son had abandoned was far more loyal than their own child. And from that day forward, Michelle would no longer be treated as a daughter-in-law. She would be treated as their daughter. 4 years passed quietly, yet those years transformed Michelle's life in ways she had never imagined. The pain of Adams's disappearance no longer defined her days. Instead, her life had slowly grown stronger, fuller, and more peaceful. The once broken household had turned into something surprisingly stable and warm. Michelle had become the center of that stability. After the incident at the hospital years earlier, Mr. and Mrs. Ikenna had made a decision that shocked everyone who knew their family. They had chosen Michelle. They had publicly declared that Michelle was now their daughter, and that Adams no longer held the place of a son in their lives. Everything they owned, their savings, their pension, and the inheritance they had spent their entire lives building would belong to her and the children. At first, Michelle had refused. But the elderly couple insisted. "You stood with us when our own son abandoned us," Mr. Ikenna had said firmly. "You did not have to do that, yet you did." So Michelle accepted their love not as wealth but as family. Soon afterward, she moved them into the large mansion she and Adams had once built together. The house that had once felt empty after Adams disappeared was now alive again. The grandparents became deeply involved in raising Donna and Andrew. They helped the children with homework, told them stories about life, and filled the house with the warmth that had once been missing. Michelle's bakery business also grew far beyond its humble beginnings. What had started as a small kitchen business soon became a successful bakery brand supplying cakes and pastries to events across Lagos. She hired several workers and eventually opened a physical bakery store that quickly gained a reputation for its quality. The children also flourished. Donna had grown into a bright 10-year-old who loved reading and painting. Andrew, now 7, was curious about everything and often followed his grandfather around the house, asking endless questions. Michelle enrolled them in a much better school, where they quickly excelled academically. Sometimes the children asked about their father. Michelle never lied. But she never spoke badly about Adams either. "When you grow older," she would gently say, "I will explain everything." The children eventually stopped asking. They had grown used to their life with their mother and grandparents. In many ways, Adams had already faded into a distant memory. Then, one quiet evening, something unexpected happened. Michelle had just finished reviewing bakery orders for the next day when she picked up her phone and began scrolling through Instagram. It had become a rare habit she only did when she had nothing else to do. As she scrolled through different posts, something suddenly caught her attention. A familiar page. The Commitment Relationship Group. For a moment she hesitated. The last time she had read anything there had been 4 years earlier. 4 years since the anonymous post that had changed everything. Curiosity pulled her in. She tapped the page and began reading the latest posts. Several relationship stories appeared one after another. Then suddenly she froze. One post stood out immediately. The title read, "I made the biggest mistake of my life and I want my family back." Michelle's heart began beating faster. Something about the words felt strangely familiar. She opened the post. The anonymous writer explained that several years earlier he had abandoned his wife and children to run away with another woman. He described how he had pretended to travel for work and later staged his own death so that his family would stop searching for him. Michelle felt her chest tighten. She kept reading. The man continued explaining that the woman he had run away with had never truly loved him. She had only been interested in his money. After he spent most of his wealth trying to impress her, she eventually left him for someone richer. Now he was alone. He wrote that he missed his parents. He missed his children. He missed the wife who had always supported him. He said he regretted everything. The final part of the post made Michelle close her eyes for a moment. The man asked the group members for advice. He wanted to return home, but he didn't know how to explain his disappearance. He was considering telling his family that he had been kidnapped and held somewhere without communication for several years. He believed that if he told a convincing story, his wife might forgive him and allow him to return to the family. Michelle slowly lowered the phone. She didn't need to see the man's name. She already knew. Adams. Her first reaction was not anger. It was something closer to disbelief. 4 years earlier, he had walked away from everything they built together. Now that his money was gone, and the woman he chased had abandoned him, he suddenly remembered the family he left behind. Michelle took a deep breath. Then she opened the comment section. Many people were already responding to the post. Some encouraged the man to return home and tell the kidnapping story. Others advised him to beg for forgiveness. A few warned him that his family might never accept him again. Michelle stared at the screen quietly. Then she locked the phone and placed it on the table. She didn't panic. She didn't cry. Instead, she simply stood up and walked toward the window. The evening air outside was calm. She already knew what was going to happen next. Adams was coming home. He believed he could walk back into the life he had abandoned. He believed that a clever lie would erase the past. But Adams had no idea how much had changed during the 4 years he had been gone. Michelle was no longer the quiet wife he once insulted. She was now a strong woman who had rebuilt her life without him. And this time, when Adams returned, he would not be welcomed by the weak family he had left behind. He would face the consequences of his own choices. Michelle looked out at the dark Lagos sky and spoke softly to herself. "So, you're coming back." Her voice carried no fear, only certainty. Because the man who had once believed he could disappear without consequences was about to discover a truth he never expected. 3 weeks after Michelle read the post in the commitment group, the quiet rhythm of life inside the Ikoyi mansion continued as usual. Donna had just returned from school and was sitting in the living room, finishing her homework. Andrew was playing with a small toy car on the floor while Mrs. Ikenna sat nearby knitting. Michelle was in the kitchen supervising one of the bakery assistants who had come to help prepare several cake orders. The house felt peaceful. No one in the house was expecting visitors. Then the doorbell rang. Andrew looked up first. "I'll get it," he shouted excitedly. Before Michelle could stop him, the boy ran toward the front door. When Andrew opened it, a tall, thin man stood outside the gate. His clothes were worn and dusty. His beard had grown unevenly, and his eyes looked tired. For a moment, the boy simply stared at him with curiosity. The man forced a smile. "Hello," he said softly. Andrew frowned. "Yes?" The man's voice trembled slightly. "Where is your mother?" Andrew turned his head and shouted into the house. "Mummy, someone is here." Michelle walked toward the door slowly, wiping her hands on a towel. But the moment she stepped into the hallway and saw the man standing outside, She stopped. It was Adams. He looked nothing like the confident businessman who had left the house 4 years earlier. The expensive clothes were gone. The arrogance in his posture had disappeared. He looked like a man who had been through years of hardship. But Michelle was not surprised. She had been expecting this moment ever since she read the post. Adam's face lit up with relief the moment he saw her. "Michelle," he said quickly, "I'm home." Michelle remained silent. Andrew looked confused. "Mummy, who is this man?" he asked. The question struck Adams like a physical blow. He stared at the boy in disbelief. "It's me," Adams said gently. "I'm your father." Andrew stepped back immediately and hid slightly behind Michelle. The boy shook his head. "You're not my daddy." Adams's expression collapsed. Donna had also walked toward the hallway by then. She looked at the stranger carefully but showed no recognition. Michelle spoke calmly. "Andrew, go back to the living room." The boy obeyed immediately. Adams swallowed nervously. They don't remember me," he said quietly. Michelle did not respond. Instead, she stepped aside slightly. "If you have something to say, say it." Adams stepped inside the house slowly. He looked around the living room as if he were seeing it for the first time. Then suddenly he rushed toward the children. "Donna, Andrew," he said eagerly. "You don't understand what happened to me." The children stared at him nervously. "I was kidnapped," Adams continued quickly. "They kept me somewhere far away. I couldn't call anyone. I couldn't send messages." He looked desperately at Michelle. "They wanted to kill me," he said, "but somehow I survived." Michelle watched him without emotion. Mrs. Ikenna slowly stood up from her chair. Adams turned toward her with sudden relief. "Mama!" he exclaimed. He rushed forward, tried to hug her. But Mrs. Ikenna stepped back. Her expression was cold. "Do not touch me," she said quietly. Adams froze. "Mama?" Mr. Ikenna had also entered the room by then, walking slowly with the help of a cane. Adams turned toward him next. "Papa," he said desperately. "I'm alive. You thought I died." Mr. Ikenna looked at him silently for a moment. Then he spoke calmly. "When you finish lying," he said, "you should leave this house." The words shocked Adams. "What?" he asked. "You heard me," Mr. Ikenna replied. Adams looked from one face to another in confusion. You don't believe me?" Mrs. Ikenna's voice was sharp. "We know everything." Adam's face drained of color. Michelle folded her arms quietly. "The commitment group," Mr. Ikenna said. Adams's heart dropped. You know about that?" "We know that you abandoned your family," Mrs. Ikenna continued. "You ran away with another woman." Adams tried to speak. "No, it's not." "Enough," Mr. Ikenna said firmly. "You left your wife, your children, and your parents for a woman who only wanted your money." The room fell silent. Adams turned toward Michelle. "You told them?" Michelle shook her head. They already knew the truth. For a moment, Adam's expression changed. The desperate man who had entered the house disappeared. The cruel man Michelle once knew returned. "You stupid woman," he snapped. "You turned my parents against me." He stepped toward her angrily. "You think you're clever?" Mrs. Ikenna immediately stepped forward. "If you insult her again," she said firmly, "I will call the police." Adams looked stunned. "You're defending her?" Mr. Ikenna's voice was calm but firm. "She is our daughter." Adams laughed bitterly. "I'm your son." Mr. Ikenna shook his head slowly. "No," he said quietly. "Our son died the day he abandoned his family." The words struck Adams harder than anything else that had been said. He looked toward the children again. "Donna," he pleaded. "Andrew." But the children remained silent. To them, he was just a stranger. The realization finally settled into Adam's mind. He had lost them. All of them. Mrs. Ikenna pointed toward the door. "Leave." Adam stood there for a long moment, unable to move. Then slowly, he turned and walked toward the door. Outside the mansion gate, he stopped briefly and looked back. Inside the house, Michelle stood calmly beside the children. And for the first time in his life, Adams understood something he had never realized before. The family he abandoned had learned how to live without him. And now there was no place left for him in their world. The rejection at the mansion stayed in Adams' mind long after he walked away from the gates that day. For years, he had imagined returning to the house with a convincing story, believing Michelle would cry with relief and welcome him back. He thought his parents would embrace him after hearing about the kidnapping he had planned to invent. Instead, he had been treated like a stranger. Even worse, his own children did not recognize him. As Adams walked through the quiet street that evening, the reality of his situation slowly began settling in. He had nowhere to go. The money he once had was gone. Pearl had left him long before he returned to Nigeria, disappearing with what little he had left after years of spending recklessly. All that remained in his pocket now was a small amount of cash, barely enough to survive a few weeks. But Adams was not ready to accept defeat. He convinced himself that the situation could still be fixed. After all, the house in Ikoyi had once belonged to him. The garage business he built had made him famous. The properties and accounts that Michelle controlled were once part of the life he created. Surely the law would recognize that. Within days, Adams contacted a lawyer. They met in a small office in Lagos Island. Adams explained everything carefully, though he avoided mentioning the truth about the fake death. Instead, he claimed that he had been kidnapped overseas and had only recently escaped. The lawyer listened patiently. "And you're saying that while you were gone," the lawyer asked slowly, "your wife transferred all the properties into her name?" "Yes," Adams said quickly. "The house, some accounts, everything." The lawyer nodded thoughtfully. "Do you have proof that you were kidnapped?" Adams hesitated. "Well, no." The lawyer leaned back in his chair. "And the letter announcing your death?" Adams swallowed. "That was a mistake." The lawyer's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Adams," he said calmly, "this case will be very difficult." Adams leaned forward. "But the house belongs to me." The lawyer shook his head. "Legally speaking, you were declared dead. Your wife had the right to handle property matters under those circumstances." Adams felt his chest tighten. "So you're saying I can't get anything back?" "I can try," the lawyer replied carefully. "But without clear evidence supporting your story, the court may not believe you." Adams insisted on pursuing the case anyway. He was desperate. A few weeks later, the matter reached court. Michelle appeared calmly with her own legal team. The judge listened carefully as Adams's lawyer attempted to explain the situation. But the story made little sense. A man who had been declared dead suddenly returning after 4 years without any proof of kidnapping or captivity. Michelle's lawyer presented documents showing that all property transfers had been done legally after Adams's official death notice. More importantly, Adams could not explain the anonymous posts in the commitment group once they were introduced as evidence. The courtroom grew quiet as the judge reviewed the details. Finally, the decision was announced. The court ruled in Michelle's favor. Adams had no legal claim to the house, the accounts, or any shared property. Everything belonged to Michelle and the children. The judge dismissed the case completely. As Adams walked out of the courthouse that day, the last piece of his former life officially disappeared. For the first time, he truly understood how much he had lost. But regret does not rebuild a life. Adams still needed somewhere to live. With the small amount of money he had left, he rented a tiny self-contained apartment in a crowded neighborhood far from the wealthy streets of Ikoyi. The building was old and poorly maintained. The single room contained just enough space for a narrow bed, a small table, and a bathroom barely larger than a closet. It was nothing like the mansion he had once lived in, but it was all he could afford. Adams also needed to work again. He returned to the only skill he truly possessed, mechanical repair. However, the years he had spent wasting money and chasing pleasure had cost him more than just his family. The industry had moved on. New mechanics had taken over the market. Some of them were younger, better trained, and more experienced with modern machines. The garage Adams once owned was now run by another mechanic who had gained the trust of his former customers. When Adams tried to reconnect with old clients, many of them barely remembered him. Some politely declined his services. Others had already found mechanics they trusted. Eventually, Adams managed to rent a tiny space on the corner of a busy roadside market. But instead of repairing luxury cars and heavy machines like he once did, he now spent his days fixing bicycles, motorcycles, and small engines. The work barely paid enough to cover rent and food. The humiliation slowly began eating away at him. At night, Adams often sat alone, inside his small apartment staring at the ceiling. The silence felt unbearable. He started drinking alcohol to quiet his thoughts. At first, it was just one bottle in the evening. Then, it became two. Soon, drinking became part of his daily routine. The alcohol dulled the pain temporarily, but the memories always returned. He remembered Michelle standing by his side when he had nothing. He remembered how she cared for his parents. He remembered the laughter of his children when they were younger. All the things he once took for granted now haunted him. One night, sitting on the edge of his bed with an empty bottle beside him, Adams whispered to himself, "I should have done better." But the words meant nothing now. The past could not be undone. Michelle had rebuilt her life. His parents had chosen her over him. His children had grown up without him. And Adams was left alone with the consequences of the choices he made. After months of drinking and regret, one morning Adams looked at his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. The man staring back at him looked older, tired, and broken. For the first time in years, he made a quiet decision. He could not change what he had done, but he could choose what to do next. Slowly, he began reducing the drinking. He started focusing more seriously on his small repair work. It wasn't the life he once had. It was smaller, harder, and lonelier. But it was the only life left for him. Because sometimes the greatest punishment in life is not revenge. Sometimes it is simply living long enough to understand the value of what you destroyed. Never take someone's love and loyalty for granted, because the people who stand by you when you have nothing are the ones who truly matter. Success does not change people, it reveals who they really are. Betrayal may seem like freedom at first, but it often destroys the one who commits it. And sometimes the greatest punishment in life is realizing too late that you lost the only people who truly loved you.
Life has a way of returning consequences for the choices we make. Adams thought that abandoning his family, his parents, and the wife that stood with him for all the years he was struggling and running away with a flame was the best thing he could do. He didn't even think about what effect it would have on his family. All he was thinking about was his happiness and putting himself first. Michelle taught him that patience, loyalty, and kindness supersedes anything. Sometimes we make choices and it haunts us for the rest of our lives. Sometimes you're able to make amends, and sometimes you're not. So the best thing to do is to try as much as possible and do good by others, especially those that love you sincerely. Because once that trust is broken, it's so hard to ever be able to unwind it. Buy my flowers. I would love to hear your thoughts about the story in the comment section. Please watch, like, and subscribe. Thank you very much. See you next time. Bye.